A girl showed up at a millionaire's gate saying, "My mom said you will take care of me." He was not ready for the truth. The shrill sound of the doorbell echoed through the mansion, breaking the meticulously maintained silence that Richard Miller cherished so much. He frowned, annoyed by the interruption of his perfectly timed morning routine. Who would dare disturb the most powerful man in New York at 7:15 in the morning? Richard adjusted his Italian silk tie in front of the hallway mirror, his grey eyes reflecting a mix of irritation and curiosity. With firm steps, he headed to the door, preparing to quickly dismiss any unwanted salesperson or mistaken delivery person. However, when he opened the heavy oak door, Richard found himself not facing an adult but a girl. She couldn't have been more than 10 years old, with disheveled brown hair and large eyes that looked at him with a mix of fear and determination. She wore simple, somewhat worn clothes and carried a battered backpack that seemed to contain all her belongings. "Can I help you?" Richard asked, his cold tone masking the confusion he felt. The girl took a deep breath, as if gathering all her courage, and then spoke in a surprisingly firm voice. "My mom said you will take care of me." Richard's world seemed to freeze for a moment. He blinked, sure he had misheard. "Sorry, what? My name is Laura," the girl continued, her voice now trembling slightly. "Clara is my mom. She's sick. She said you are my dad and that you will take care of me." The shock hit Richard like a punch in the stomach. Clara. The name evoked long-buried memories of a brief relationship that ended abruptly years ago. But a child? Impossible. "There must be some mistake," Richard said, his mind racing to find a logical explanation. "I don't have children. You must be looking for someone else." Laura bit her lip, tears starting to form in her eyes. "There's no mistake. Mom showed me pictures of you. She told me about you, please." Her voice broke. "She needs help." "I need help." Richard felt the weight of the girl's gaze, a disconcerting mix of hope and despair. Part of him wanted to close the door, deny everything, keep his perfectly ordered world intact. But something in those eyes, so familiar yet strange, stopped him. "Come in," he heard himself say, opening the door wider. Let's talk about this." As Laura passed by him, Richard noticed the curious glances of the security guards at the gate. Great, he thought bitterly. By the end of the day, all of New York would know that Richard Miller had a supposed daughter showing up at his door. In the luxurious living room, Laura seemed out of place, a splash of simple colors against the minimalist and expensive design. Richard watched her, looking for traces of himself, of Clara, anything that could confirm or deny the absurd story. "Do you have any proof?" he finally asked, his voice softer than he intended. Laura nodded, opening her backpack with trembling hands. She took out a crumpled photo and handed it to Richard. He took it, his heart racing as he recognized the scene. It was him, younger, smiling in a way he hadn't in years, with his arm around Clara. The date in the lower right corner matched exactly with the period of their brief relationship. "Turn it over," Laura said quietly. Richard obeyed, feeling as if he were in a dream. On the back, in Clara's unmistakable handwriting, it said, "Richard and I, 3 weeks before finding out about you, my love." Richard's world began to spin. Memories, doubts, and possibilities flooded his mind. He looked at Laura, truly seeing her for the first time. The shape of her eyes, the contour of her chin. How had he not noticed before? Richard began, but was interrupted by the shrill sound of his cell phone. His assistant's name flashed on the screen, reminding him of the crucial meeting that was about to start. A merger that would define the future of his company. Richard looked from the phone to Laura, feeling the weight of two worlds colliding. The girl watched him, his eyes full of expectation and fear. At that moment, Richard Miller, the man who always had all the answers, found himself at the biggest crossroads of his life, and for the first time in years he had no idea what his next step would be. The phone kept ringing insistently in Richard's hand, but he barely heard it. His mind was immersed in long-suppressed memories, triggered by Laura's unexpected presence. "I need to take this," he murmured, more to himself than to the girl. With an automatic gesture, he silenced the cell phone and put it in his pocket. "Stay here," he said to Laura, his voice softer than he intended. "I'll get you something to eat." As he walked to the kitchen, Richard felt the weight of Laura's gaze on his back. Alone for a moment, he leaned on the cold marble counter, trying to control his breathing. The memories assaulted him like violent waves. 8 years ago, the office buzzed with the typical end-of-day energy. Richard, then a rising executive, was organizing papers on his desk when a soft knock on the door caught his attention. "Excuse me, Mr. Miller." The melodious voice of Clara, his new secretary, made him look up. "I brought the reports you requested," Richard smiled, noticing not for the first time how her eyes sparkled when she smiled back. Clara was different from the other employees, intelligent, discreet, and surprisingly funny when she allowed herself to be. "Thank you, Clara," he replied, taking the documents. Their fingers briefly touched, sending an electric current through his body. "Would you like to have a coffee? To discuss the project, of course." The blush on Clara's cheeks and her shy smile were answer enough. That coffee turned into dinners, late nights at work, and eventually an intense, though secret, relationship. Clara was a breath of fresh air in Richard's methodical life. With her he allowed himself to laugh, dream, be vulnerable. But as the months passed, Richard felt the weight of expectations. From the company, from his family, from himself. The empire he was building demanded sacrifices, and a relationship with a secretary did not fit into his grand plans. The memory of the last time he saw Clara hit him with full force. Her face pale and shocked when he coldly ended the relationship, citing his career as a priority. The tears she refused to shed, the tremor in her voice when she said she understood, that she knew from the beginning it wouldn't last. Richard had convinced himself it was for the best for both of them. Clara deserved someone who could give her a normal life, a family. He had an empire to build. In the days that followed, Clara didn't show up for work. When Richard finally gathered the courage to ask about her in HR, he was informed that she had resigned, citing personal problems. He never saw her again. Until today, in the form of that familiar-eyed girl sitting on his couch. The sound of the kettle brought him back to the present. Richard mechanically prepared a cup of tea and took some cookies from a tin. Returning to the living room, he found Laura exactly where he had left her, looking small and vulnerable on the immense leather sofa. "Here," he offered the tea and cookies, feeling strangely inadequate. "Sorry, I don't have much suitable for children." Laura accepted the cup with a murmur of thanks. Her eyes, Clara's eyes, Richard realized, studying him intently. "You really didn't know about me?" she finally asked, her voice small but firm. Richard sat heavily in the opposite armchair. "No," he admitted, the word heavy with regret and confusion. "Your mother, Clara never told me. She said she tried," Laura replied, a touch of defiance in her voice. "She said you were always busy, that your assistants never passed on her messages." Guilt hit Richard like a punch in the stomach. How many times had he instructed his team to filter out unwanted calls? How many missed opportunities to know the truth? I'm sorry," he heard himself say, the words strange in his mouth. Richard Miller didn't apologize. He corrected mistakes with ruthless efficiency. But here, in front of this child, his daughter, he felt completely lost. Laura watched him with a mix of curiosity and caution. "Mum is really sick," she said finally, her voice trembling slightly. "She needs treatment we can't afford. She didn't want me to come, but I didn't know what else to do." Richard felt the weight of responsibility, of lost time and wrong choices accumulating on his shoulders. His phone vibrated again in his pocket, reminding him of the world out there, of the empire he had built at the expense of everything else. Looking at Laura, he saw not just Clara's reflection, but also a part of himself he had long forgotten. And at that moment, Richard Miller knew his life would never be the same. Laura watched the man in front of her, her father, with a mix of fascination and apprehension. Richard Miller was exactly as her mother had described, tall, imposing, with grey eyes that seemed to see through her. But there was something more, a vulnerability she hadn't expected to see in the face of the powerful businessman. While Richard seemed lost in his thoughts, Laura let her mind wander to the events that had brought her there. 3 months earlier. The small apartment Laura shared with her mother, Clara, was silent except for the occasional sound of coughing coming from the bedroom. Laura, sitting at the kitchen table, tried to concentrate on her homework, but her eyes kept drifting to the closed bedroom door. Clara had gotten worse in recent weeks. The nights were the worst, with coughing fits that seemed to last for hours. During the day, she struggled to maintain normality, but Laura could see the exhaustion in her eyes, the way her hands trembled while preparing breakfast. "Laura?" Clara's weak voice called from the bedroom. Dropping her pencil, Laura ran to her mother's side. Clara was sitting on the bed, her pale face contrasting with the feverish red of her cheeks. "I'm here, Mom," Laura said, holding Clara's hand. Clara smiled weakly. "My love, we need to talk about something important." Laura's heart raced. She knew something was wrong for weeks, but her mother always dodged the questions. "It's about your father," Clara began, her voice trembling. Laura held her breath. Her father was a rarely discussed topic. All she knew came from fragments of overheard conversations and a few old photos hidden in a box under Clara's bed. "His name is Richard Miller," Clara continued, her eyes focused on a distant point. He doesn't know about you. I tried to tell him, but..." Clara's words were interrupted by a coughing fit. Laura waited anxiously, 1,000 questions in her mind. When the coughing finally subsided, Clara looked even more exhausted. "Laura, my love, I'm sick more than you know. I need treatment that we can't afford." Fear gripped Laura's chest. "But they'll help you at the hospital, won't they? There has to be a way." Clara shook her head sadly. "The treatment is experimental, very expensive. But your father, he has resources. He could help." Laura felt a mix of hope and anger. Why would he help us now? He never cared before. "He didn't know, Laura," Clara said softly. "It was my choice not to insist on telling him. But now, you need to find him. For me. For both of us." In the following weeks, Laura planned her journey in secret. She researched Richard Miller online, memorized the address of his mansion, and saved every penny she could for the bus fare. On the eve of her departure, Laura found Clara asleep. Silently, she took the photo of her mother with Richard, the proof she needed, and put it in her backpack along with some clothes and the little money she had saved. She left a note. "I went to get help. I'll be back soon. I love you, Mom." The trip to New York was a haze of anxiety and determination. Laura repeated to herself the words she would say to Richard, rehearsing every possible scenario, and now, here she was, sitting on the luxurious sofa of a man who was practically a stranger, but who carried half of her DNA. "Laura!" Richard's voice brought her back to the present. He was watching her with an expression she couldn't decipher. Concern, guilt, she wasn't sure. "Yes," she replied, trying to keep her voice steady. Richard seemed to be fighting an internal battle. Finally, he spoke. I want to help, but I need to understand the situation better. Can you tell me more about your mother's illness?" Laura felt a wave of relief and hope. He wanted to help, she began to speak, the words coming out in a rushed stream, detailing Clara's symptoms, hospital visits, inconclusive diagnoses. As she spoke, Laura watched Richard's expressions change, from shock to concern, and then to something that looked like determination. When she finished, there was a heavy silence. Richard stood up abruptly, picking up his phone. "I'll make some calls," he said, his voice taking on a tone Laura recognized from the interview videos she had watched online, the tone of the businessman solving problems. "I will find out exactly what your mother needs and how we can help." Laura felt tears of relief welling up in her eyes. She had come this far, had found her father, and he was willing to help. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to feel a spark of hope. While Richard made his calls, Laura looked out the window at the immaculate gardens of the mansion. Her world had been turned upside down in the last 24 hours, and she knew more changes were coming. But for Clara, for a chance to save her mother, she was ready to face anything. Richard Miller looked out at the city of New York through the window of his office on the top floor of the imposing skyscraper that housed the headquarters of his business empire. The view was breathtaking, but his eyes were unfocused, his mind still in the mansion where he had left Laura in the care of his housekeeper. The sound of a notification on his smartphone brought him back to reality. It was a message from his personal assistant. reminding him of the board meeting in 15 minutes. Richard sighed, adjusting his silk tie and preparing for another day of corporate battles. As he walked through the corridors towards the meeting room, Richard couldn't help but notice how everything seemed different now. The employees who bowed respectfully as he passed, the expensive paintings on the walls, even the soft carpet under his feet. Everything seemed somehow less important, less real than the little girl with familiar eyes who had shown up at his door that morning. Entering the meeting room, Richard was greeted with the usual chorus of "Good morning, Mr. Miller" from the board members. He nodded briefly, taking his place at the head of the table. "Let's begin," he said, his voice firm and controlled as always. "What are the updates on the merger with Technova?" As his CFO began presenting the numbers, Richard found himself struggling to concentrate. His mind kept returning to Laura, to Clara, to the past he had so carefully buried. Mr. Miller, Carla, the legal director, brought him back to the present. "Do you have any questions about the terms of the contract?" Richard blinked, realizing he had missed part of the discussion. This never happened. He was known for his meticulous attention to detail, for his ability to spot opportunities and threats that others missed. Just give me a summary of the main points," he said, trying to regain control. As Carla spoke, Richard noticed the confused glances exchanged among the board members. They had never seen him like this, distracted, almost vulnerable. The meeting continued, but for Richard, it was as if he were watching everything from outside his own body. The discussions about profit margins, market strategies, and financial projections seemed trivial compared to the personal drama unfolding in his life. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the meeting ended. While the others left, Richard remained seated, looking at the papers in front of him without really seeing them. "Richard?" The voice of Henry, his longtime friend and personal legal advisor, surprised him. He hadn't realized anyone was still in the room. "Is everything okay? You seem distant." For a moment, Richard considered lying, saying he was just tired or worried about the merger. But looking at Henry's concerned face, he felt a sudden need to share his burden. "Henry," he began, his voice lower and more uncertain than it had ever been in a meeting room, "I just found out I have a daughter." The shock on Henry's face was almost comical. "What? How? When?" Richard laughed without humor. "Apparently 10 years ago, with Clara, my ex-secretary, she showed up at my door this morning." As Richard told the story, he could see Henry's mind working, probably already considering the legal and public relations implications. "This is all complicated," Henry finally said. "And what do you intend to do?" Richard looked out the window at the city he had conquered with so much effort. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I can't ignore this. Her mother is sick, needs treatment, and Laura, she's my daughter, Henry. My daughter." Henry nodded slowly. "I understand. But Richard, you need to be careful. News like this could affect the company, the shareholders." "I know," Richard interrupted, a hint of his usual assertiveness returning to his voice. "But for the first time in my life, Henry, the company is not my biggest concern." At that moment, looking at Henry's astonished expression, Richard realized how much his life had changed in just a few hours. The empire he had built with so much care and sacrifice suddenly seemed fragile and insignificant compared to the weight of the responsibility he now felt for Laura and Clara. As he got up to return to his office, Richard knew he was on the verge of a profound transformation. The man who had entered that meeting room was not the same one who was leaving, and the empire he had built would have to adapt to this new reality, whether he liked it or not. Richard closed the door to his private office, isolating himself from the company's bustle. His gaze swept across the room, noticing for the first time how impersonal and cold it was. No family photos, no personal objects, just awards, diplomas, and a panoramic view of New York. With a heavy sigh, he sat at his desk and opened his laptop. Doubts gnawed at him from the inside, and he knew he needed answers. Quickly, he typed Clara's name into the search engine. The results were sparse. A few mentions in local newspapers from a small town upstate, nothing recent. Richard frowned, frustrated. He needed more. Picking up the phone, he dialed a number he rarely used. Maurice, it's Richard Miller. I need a discreet favor. Maurice was a private investigator Richard occasionally hired to check the background of potential business partners. Now, he needed those services for a much more personal matter. I need all the information you can find on Clara Johnson. She worked as my secretary about 10 years ago, and on a girl named Laura, who would be her daughter. It's urgent and must be kept absolutely confidential. While waiting for Maurice's information, Richard tried to focus on work, but his mind kept returning to Laura. The resemblance between them was undeniable. But what if it was just a coincidence? What if it was all an elaborate scam? A sharp sound interrupted his thoughts. It was a notification from his financial news app. Opening it, Richard felt his stomach sink. Mysterious child seen at Richard Miller's mansion. Sources speculate about possible secret heir. The news was vague, more speculation than facts, but it was enough to cause ripples in the corporate world. Richard knew it was only a matter of time before reporters started calling, demanding answers. As if responding to his thoughts, his phone began ringing incessantly. He recognized the numbers, his PR team, journalists, board members. Richard ignored them, focusing on the task at hand. Hours passed. Richard alternated between reviewing company documents and frantically researching diseases that matched the symptoms described by Laura. Every minute, he felt the weight of his ignorance, of years lost. Finally, his phone buzzed with a message from Maurice. Preliminary information obtained. Clara Johnson, 38 years old, resident of Brooklyn, NY, worked as a secretary in New York from 2010 to 2013. Daughter, Laura Johnson, 10 years old, born 8/15/2013. Birth certificate does not list the father. Recent medical records show frequent visits to the local hospital. Inconclusive diagnosis. More details to follow. Richard felt his heart race. The dates matched perfectly. The absence of his name on the birth certificate, the medical visits, everything fit Laura's story. Before he could fully process this information, a firm knock sounded at his door. It was Carla, his legal director, looking concerned. "Richard, we need to talk. The rumors are spreading quickly. The board is demanding an explanation, and the press won't stop calling." "What's going on?" Richard looked at Carla, realizing he could no longer delay the inevitable. He needed to make a decision, and fast. "Carla, call Henry and gather the PR team. We have a delicate situation to manage." As Carla left to carry out his orders, Richard looked once more out the window. The city outside continued its normal hustle, unaware of the drama unfolding at the top of that skyscraper. His phone buzzed again. It was a message from his housekeeper. "Mr. Miller, the girl is asking when you'll be back. She seems anxious." Richard closed his eyes, feeling the weight of his responsibilities. On one side, a corporate empire he had built over decades. On the other, a scared girl who had appeared out of nowhere, claiming to be his daughter. Taking a deep breath, he made his decision. Grabbing his jacket, Richard headed for the door. He needed to go home, to Laura. The explanations to the world could wait. Now he had a daughter to get to know and a truth to face. As he left his office, Richard knew he was leaving behind more than just a building. He was stepping away from a version of himself, from the man he had been for so many years. What awaited him on the other side of that door was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, Richard Miller was following his heart, not his head. The room was bathed in a comforting twilight, the curtains filtering the afternoon sunlight. Clara was sitting on her bed, propped up by a pile of pillows, her frail body contrasting with the determination in her eyes. She was staring intently at the photo in her hands, the same one Laura had taken to Richard. A coughing fit shook her, cruelly reminding her of her condition. When she finally caught her breath, Clara returned her thoughts to the past, to the moment her life changed forever. 11 years ago. Clara looked at the pregnancy test, her hands trembling. Positive. Her heart raced, a mix of fear and excitement taking over her. Richard would be a father. They would be a family. But then reality hit her like a cold bucket of water. Richard, the ambitious and focused man she knew so well, was not ready to be a father. He had made it clear that his career was his top priority. That night, Clara tried to tell him. She arrived at the office early, determined to share the news before the busy day started. But Richard barely looked at her, absorbed in an important call. "Shall I not now, Clara?" he said, gesturing for her to leave. "I have a crucial meeting in 5 minutes." Days turned into weeks, and Clara never found the right moment. Every time she tried to broach the subject, Richard was too busy, too stressed, too focused on his next big deal. And then came the final blow. On a cold autumn night, Richard called her into his office. "Hi, Clara," he said, his voice cold and distant. "This isn't working. Our arrangement is interfering with my work. It's best if we end it now." Clara's world collapsed. She wanted to scream, to tell him about the baby, to beg for a chance. But the determined look on Richard's face, the way he had already turned back to his papers as if she were no longer there, silenced her. That night, alone in her apartment, Clara made a decision. She would raise this baby alone. Her child would not grow up feeling like a burden, an obstacle to Richard Miller's great career. Back in the present, Clara sighed, putting the photo aside. Sometimes she wondered if she had made the right choice. Laura was the light of her life, but raising a child alone had been incredibly difficult. Another coughing fit overtook her, stronger this time. When it passed, Clara noticed blood on her handkerchief. Fear gripped her, not for herself, but for Laura. What would happen to her daughter if she couldn't overcome this illness? The doctors still didn't have a conclusive diagnosis. Something in her lungs, they said, possibly related to exposure to some toxic agent years ago. The treatment was expensive, experimental, out of her reach. Clara closed her eyes, remembering the day she finally told Laura about her father. It had been a few months ago when the symptoms started to worsen. "But why didn't he ever look for us?" Laura had asked, her eyes full of hurt. "He didn't know about you, my love," Clara replied softly. "It was my choice not to tell him." Now, as the illness progressed, Clara wondered if she had made a mistake, not for herself, but for Laura. Her daughter deserved to know her father, to have a chance at a better life. A sound in the living room pulled her from her thoughts. It was the TV, on low to not disturb her. Clara strained to hear. Speculations about a possible secret daughter of magnate Richard Miller. Clara's heart skipped a beat. Laura, she had really gone to find Richard. Part of her felt proud of her daughter's courage. Another part felt fear about what this could mean. Clara picked up her phone, her hands trembling slightly. She needed to call Richard, explain everything. But as she held the phone, she hesitated. What would she say? How would she explain her years of silence? At that moment, looking at a photo of a distant past and listening to the news that could change her future, Clara felt the weight of her decisions. She had kept Laura away from Richard to protect her, but now she realized she might have deprived her daughter of a crucial part of her identity. Taking a deep, shaky breath, Clara began to dial the number. It was time to face the past, for Laura, for Richard, and for herself. As the phone rang, she prayed it wasn't too late to fix past mistakes and give Laura the future she deserved. Richard stared intently at the envelope in his hands, his heart pounding against his chest. The DNA test result that would confirm or deny his paternity was right there, a few inches from his eyes. With trembling fingers, he tore open the envelope and pulled out the paper. His eyes quickly scanned the document, stopping abruptly at the words that would change his life forever. Probability of paternity, 99.9%. The world around him seemed to disappear for a moment. Richard fell heavily into the nearest chair, the reality hitting him like a punch in the stomach. He was a father to Laura, the bright-eyed girl he had met a few weeks ago. After a few minutes of initial shock, Richard picked up the phone and dialed Laura's number. When she answered, his voice came out hoarse and emotional. "Laura, it's Richard. The result is in... I am your father." On the other end of the line, there was a moment of silence before Laura responded, her voice equally filled with emotion. "Richard, I always knew. Thank you for taking the test. Mom will be so happy to know she has a father." They agreed to meet the next day to talk in person and decide how to proceed from there. Richard barely slept that night, his mind a storm of conflicting thoughts and emotions. The next day, Richard arrived at the cafe where he had arranged to meet Laura, nervous and anxious. She was already there, sitting at a corner table, an untouched cup of coffee in front of her. When she saw him, she smiled hesitantly. "Hi, Richard," Laura greeted as he sat down. "How are you feeling?" Richard let out a deep sigh before answering. "Honestly, I'm a mess. Happy, scared, excited, terrified, all at the same time." Laura nodded understandingly. "It's normal to feel that way. It's a big change in your life." "Laura," Richard began, his voice serious, "I want you to know that I intend to take all my responsibilities as a father. I want to be part of Laura's life, if you'll allow me." Laura's eyes filled with tears. "Of course I allow it, Richard. Laura deserves to know her father, and I'm sure you two will get along great." Richard smiled, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders. But there was something else that worried him, something Laura had briefly mentioned in their first meeting. "Laura," he said hesitantly, "you mentioned before that Laura has some special needs. Can you tell me more about that?" Laura's smile faltered for a moment, and she lowered her eyes to her coffee. When she looked back at Richard, there was a mix of love and concern in her gaze. "Laura has autism," she said softly. "So she was diagnosed about a year ago." Richard felt his heart tighten. "Autism?" he repeated, trying to process the information. Laura nodded. "Yes, she is on the autism spectrum, but is considered high-functioning. Laura is incredibly intelligent and loving, but has difficulties with social interactions, and sometimes gets overwhelmed by sensory stimuli." Richard listened attentively as Laura explained more about Laura's condition. She spoke about the therapies Laura attended, about how she sometimes had trouble communicating verbally, and how certain noises or textures could make her extremely uncomfortable. "But Richard," Laura continued, a gentle smile on her lips, "Laura is the most wonderful child you could imagine. She sees the world in a unique and beautiful way. Her passion for numbers and patterns is fascinating, and when she connects with someone, it's in a deep and sincere way that few can achieve." Richard felt a wave of emotion wash over him. He realized that, far from diminishing his love for the daughter he had just discovered, this revelation only made him want to protect and love her even more. "I want to learn," he said with determination. "I want to learn everything I can about autism, about how I can help Laura, how I can be the best father possible for her." Laura smiled, tears of relief and gratitude in her eyes. "That means a lot, Richard. Laura will love having you in her life." They spent the next few hours discussing Laura, her diagnosis, her needs, and how Richard could get involved in her life gradually and respectfully. Richard absorbed every piece of information attentively, asking questions and making mental notes. By the end of the conversation, Richard felt emotionally exhausted, but also filled with a new purpose. He had a daughter now, a special daughter who needed him. "When can I see Laura again?" he asked eagerly. Laura smiled. "How about next weekend? We can meet at the park. Laura loves the swings there." Richard agreed enthusiastically. As they said their goodbyes, he felt a mix of nerves and excitement. His life had changed drastically in the last 24 hours, but he was ready to face this new challenge. That night, lying in his bed, Richard found himself imagining the future. He saw himself pushing Laura on the swing, helping her with homework, celebrating her achievements. He knew the road wouldn't be easy, that there would be challenges and difficult moments, but he also knew with a certainty that came from deep within his heart that every moment would be worth it. With a smile on his lips, Richard fell asleep, dreaming of the day he would hear Laura call him Dad for the first time. The small cafe in downtown New York seemed an unlikely place for a meeting that could change the course of several lives. Laura arrived first, choosing a discreet table in the corner. Her eyes alternated between the door and the clock on the wall, her anxiety growing with each passing minute. Clara arrived next, her face pale and tired, but with a determined gleam in her eyes. She hugged Laura tightly, as if seeking strength for what was to come. "Has he arrived yet?" Clara asked, her voice trembling. Laura shook her head. "Not yet, but he should be on his way." The two sat down, a tense silence hanging between them. Laura could feel her mother's nervousness, noticing how her hands trembled slightly as she held the menu. Exactly at 3 p.m., the cafe door opened, and Richard walked in. His gaze scanned the room until he found Clara and Laura. For a moment, he seemed to freeze, as if the reality of the situation was finally hitting him. Laura watched intently as Richard approached. His posture was stiff, his face a mask of control, but his eyes betrayed a storm of emotions. "Clara," Richard said, his voice surprisingly soft. "It's been a long time." Clara stood up slowly, her eyes fixed on Richard's. "Richard," she replied, her voice barely a whisper. "Thank you for coming." For a moment, no one moved. The air seemed heavy with unspoken words, years of secrets and regrets. Laura felt as if she were witnessing something intensely private, almost sacred. Finally, Richard broke the silence. "Why didn't you tell me?" The words came out abruptly, laden with pain and accusation. Clara closed her eyes for a moment, as if gathering strength. When she opened them again, there was a mix of sadness and determination in her gaze. "I tried, Richard. In the beginning, I tried so many times, but you were always busy, always focused on the next big achievement. And then you ended things with me, and I thought it would be better this way." Richard let out a frustrated sigh. "Better? How could hiding my daughter from me be better?" "Dad," Laura intervened softly, touching Richard's arm. "Please, sit down. Let's talk." The use of the word "dad" seemed to hit Richard like a shock. He looked at Laura, then back at Clara, before finally sitting down. Clara began to cough, a harsh and painful sound. Laura immediately reached for a glass of water, her concern evident. Richard watched the scene with a mix of confusion and worry. "Are you sick?" he said, not a question but a statement. Clara nodded, catching her breath. "That's why Laura went to you. I need treatment that I can't afford." Richard frowned. "Why didn't you come to me before? I could have helped." "Pride, maybe," Clara replied with a sad smile. "Or fear. Fear that you would reject us, that you wouldn't want anything to do with Laura." "I would never do that," Richard said firmly, surprising himself with the conviction in his voice. Laura watched the interaction, feeling a mix of hope and apprehension. She could see the pain in both their eyes, but also a glimmer of something more. A connection that neither time nor distance had managed to erase completely. "Laura told me about the autism," Richard said softly, turning to his daughter. I want to help. I want to be part of her life." Clara let out a muffled sob, tears starting to stream down her face. "I'm so sorry, Richard. I'm sorry for hiding this from you for so long." Richard hesitantly reached out, touching Clara's arm. "I'm sorry too, for not being there, for not realizing." Laura felt her own tears beginning to fall, seeing her parents, two people she loved deeply, finally confronting years of secrets and misunderstandings was emotionally overwhelming. "Sayers, what do we do now?" Laura asked, her voice choked with emotion. Richard took a deep breath, looking from Clara to Laura. "Now, we take care of you, Clara. We get you the treatment you need, and then we figure out how to be a family." Clara nodded, a small smile breaking through her tears. "I would like that." Laura watched as her parents exchanged a long, meaningful look. There was still much to be said, much to be resolved. But in that moment, in that small cafe in New York, a new hope had been born. As they began to discuss the next steps, Clara's treatment, how to introduce Richard to Laura, how to navigate this new family dynamic, Laura felt a weight lift from her shoulders. The road ahead would be difficult, full of challenges and adjustments. But for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to believe that everything would be all right. The tense reunion had transformed into something more, the beginning of a journey of healing, forgiveness, and perhaps a second chance for all of them. Richard Miller stared at the city of New York through the window of his office, his reflection in the glass showing a man divided. The past few weeks had been an emotional roller coaster, and now he found himself facing one of the biggest dilemmas of his life. A soft knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. "Come in," he said, turning to see Henry, his lawyer and longtime friend, entering the room. "The board is waiting, Richard," Henry said, his voice a mix of concern and urgency. "They want answers," Richard nodded, adjusting his tie. "Let's go then." As he entered the boardroom, Richard felt the weight of the board members' gazes. Serious faces stared back at him, some with curiosity, others with clear disapproval. "Mr. Millers," began Carlos Alvarez, the chairman of the board, "the rumors about your personal situation are negatively impacting our company. The shareholders are restless. The press won't stop speculating. We need an official statement." Richard took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. "Ladies and gentlemen, I understand your concerns. It is true that I recently discovered I have a daughter from a past relationship. I am dealing with this situation as best as I can." A murmur went through the room. Mariana Silva, one of the most influential directors, leaned forward. "And what about the allegations that you are diverting company resources for medical treatments?" Richard felt a pang of anger. "Those allegations are unfounded. Any assistance I am providing is from my personal resources." "Even so," Carlos interjected, "the mere appearance of impropriety can be damaging. We suggest that you temporarily step down from your position as CEO until this situation is resolved." Shock coursed through Richard's body. Step down from the company he had built from scratch. "God, this is ridiculous," he protested. "My personal life does not affect my ability to lead this company." "It's not just your personal life, Richard," Henry said softly. "It's the potential for scandal, lawsuits, damage to the company's reputation." Richard looked at his friend, feeling betrayed. But deep down, he knew Henry was just doing his job. "Give me 48 hours, Richard said finally. "I'll prepare an official statement and a plan of action." The board reluctantly agreed, and Richard left the room feeling the weight of the world on his shoulders. Back in his office, he sank into his chair, his mind a whirlwind. How could he balance his responsibilities as CEO with his newly discovered obligations as a father? How could he help Clara with her treatment without raising suspicions of misconduct? His phone vibrated. It was a message from Laura with a photo of Clara. The girl smiled shyly at the camera, her eyes, his eyes, shining with a mix of hope and uncertainty. Richard felt his heart tighten. He barely knew Clara, but already felt a deep connection with her. The thought of not being able to help her, of having to choose between his career and his daughter, was unbearable. He picked up the phone, dialing Clara's number. "Richard." Her voice sounded surprised. "Clara, I need to know the treatment. How much would it cost?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. It's very expensive, Richard. Millions. That's why I never... I'll pay," he said abruptly. "I'll find a way." "Richard, no," Clara protested. "Your company, your reputation." "Some things are more important," he responded, surprising himself with the conviction in his voice. After hanging up, Richard stared at the phone for a long moment. He knew that what he was about to do could cost him everything he had built, but for the first time in his life, that didn't seem like the most important thing. With renewed determination, he began typing an email, not to the board, not to his lawyers, but to an old friend who worked in medical research. If he was going to risk everything, it would be on his own terms. As the words flowed on the screen, Richard felt a strange sense of peace. No matter what the board decided, no matter what the press said, he had made his choice. Clara would get the treatment she needed. Laura would have the father she deserved. And Richard, he would finally be the man he always should have been. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, Richard Miller was at peace with his decisions. Whatever the cost, he would face it. For Clara, for Laura, and for the person he wanted to become. The office of Dr. Mark Silva, one of the most renowned pulmonary specialists in the country, was steeped in a tense silence. Richard Miller, Clara, and Laura sat in front of the doctor's desk, anxiously awaiting the results of Clara's latest tests. Dr. Mark adjusted his glasses, his expression grave as he flipped through the medical file. "Ms. Johnson," he began, addressing Clara, After a thorough analysis of your tests and medical history, we discovered something troubling. Richard felt Clara stiffen beside him. Instinctively, he placed a hand over hers, a gesture of support that surprised them both. "What is it, doctor?" Clara asked, her voice barely a whisper. The doctor took a deep breath before continuing. "Your current condition is not the result of a natural illness. In fact, it is the consequence of a serious medical error that occurred approximately 8 years ago." The shock was palpable in the room. Laura gasped, clutching her mother's hand. Richard felt as if the ground had been pulled out from under his feet. "What kind of error?" Richard asked, his voice tense. During a routine surgery at Central Hospital, a chemical substance was mistakenly administered to Clara. This substance caused progressive damage to her lungs, resulting in her current condition. Clara covered her mouth with her hands, silent tears streaming down her face. All this time and all this suffering, Richard felt a wave of anger wash over him. How could this happen? And why are we only finding out now? Dr. Mark seemed genuinely disturbed. Unfortunately, the effects of this substance are slow and cumulative. Without knowing what to look for specifically, it was easy to confuse it with other pulmonary conditions. It was only by conducting a deeper analysis of the entire history that we were able to identify the true cause. Laura, who had remained silent until then, spoke with a trembling voice. "Is there a cure?" The doctor hesitated. "There is a treatment, but it is experimental and extremely expensive. It involves a series of procedures to remove the damaged tissue and stimulate lung regeneration." Richard nodded, determined. "Money is not an issue. We will do whatever it takes." It was then that Dr. Mark looked directly at Richard, his expression even more serious. "Mr. Miller, there's something else you need to know. Central Hospital, where the error occurred, isn't it the main partner of your company?" Richard's world seemed to freeze. Central Hospital was indeed one of the largest partners of his corporation. They had recently closed a multi-million-dollar contract for the development of new medical technologies. This changes everything," Richard murmured, more to himself than to the others. Clara looked at him, confused. "What do you mean?" Richard stood up abruptly, walking to the window of the office. His mind raced, analyzing the implications. If he exposed Central Hospital's error, the scandal would be immense. The hospital would face lawsuits, its reputation would be destroyed, and the contract with his company would certainly be cancelled. The financial losses would be astronomical. On the other hand, if he concealed this information to protect his business interests, he would be denying Clara the justice she deserved. Moreover, how many other people might have been victims of similar errors? "Richard?" Laura's voice brought him back to reality. "What are we going to do?" He turned, facing the anxious faces of Clara and Laura. In that moment, he saw not just the mother of his daughter and the child he had just met, but 2 lives that depended on his decision. "So as we are going to expose the truth," he said finally, his voice firm, "we will sue the hospital and ensure that Clara receives the treatment she deserves." Clara looked at him with a mix of surprise and gratitude. "But what about your company? Didn't you say the hospital is your partner?" Richard walked back to the chair, sitting down with a heavy sigh. "Yes, it is. And this will probably cost us millions, maybe even billions. But some things are more important than money." Laura smiled, tears in her eyes. "Thank you, Dad." That single word, Dad, solidified Richard's decision. He knew the road ahead would be difficult. The board would be furious, the shareholders would panic, and his reputation in the business world might never fully recover. But looking at Clara and Laura, he knew he was doing the right thing. For the first time in his life, Richard Miller was choosing ethics over business, family over fortune. "Doctor." "Mark," Richard said, turning to the doctor, "I need you to prepare a detailed report of your findings. We will need all the documentation possible." The doctor nodded solemnly. "I will do that immediately, Mr. Miller." As they left the doctor's office, Richard felt the weight of his decision, but also a strange lightness. The future was uncertain, but he would face whatever came. With Clara and Laura by his side, he was ready to fight not just for justice, but for a second chance to be the man and father he always should have been. Richard's office, once a sanctuary of power and control, now felt suffocating. He paced back and forth, the report from Dr. Mark weighing in his hands like lead. Each page detailed the medical error that had condemned Clara to years of silent suffering. A soft knock on the door interrupted his turbulent thoughts. "Come in," he said, his voice hoarse with exhaustion. Laura entered, her eyes, so much like his, filled with concern and determination. "Dad," she began, the words still new and strange for both of them. "We need to talk." Richard nodded, gesturing for her to sit. "About the report, I presume?" "Yes," Laura replied, sitting on the edge of the chair. "You're going to expose the hospital, aren't you? They need to be held accountable for what they did to Mom." Richard sighed heavily, running a hand through his graying hair. "Laura, it's not that simple. Central Hospital is a crucial partner of my company. Exposing this error won't just affect them, but us as well. Thousands of jobs are at stake, not to mention the research projects we're funding." Laura frowned, disappointment evident on her face. "So you're going to protect your profits instead of doing the right thing? Is that it?" The words hit Richard like a slap. "It's not about profits," he argued. "It's about the bigger impact. If my company suffers, many innocent people will be affected." "And what about my mum?" Laura retorted, her voice trembling with emotion. "What about the other possible victims of this hospital? Don't they deserve justice?" Richard felt the weight of guilt and responsibility pressing on his shoulders. He walked to the window, looking down at the city below. New York, a metropolis he had helped shape with his businesses. How many lives had been impacted by his decisions over the years? "Laura," he began, turning to face her, "you have to understand, in the business world, sometimes we have to make tough choices for the greater good." "Greater for whom?" Laura challenged, standing up. "For the shareholders, for your ego, or for the people who really need help?" Laura's words echoed in Richard's mind, reminding him of a younger version of himself, a version that had not yet been corrupted by the pressures of the corporate world. "You know," Laura continued, her voice softer now, "when I was little, Mom used to tell me stories about you. She said you were a man of principles, someone who always did the right thing, no matter the cost." Richard felt a lump in his throat. Clara had kept that image of him, even after everything. "I grew up admiring this man I never met," Laura continued, "hoping to one day meet him. And now that I finally have the chance, I can't believe you would hesitate to do the right thing." Silence fell heavily between them. Richard looked at the report in his hands, then at the photo of Clara and Laura that now sat on his desk. Finally, his eyes met his daughter's. "You're right," he said quietly. "I lost my way at some point. I let the fear of losing what I built obscure my values." Laura took a step forward, placing a hand on Richard's arm. "It's not too late to do the right thing, Dad." Richard nodded slowly, a resolution forming in his chest. "I'll call a meeting with the board immediately. We'll expose Central Hospital's error and accept the consequences." Laura's face lit up with a smile, and she impulsively hugged Richard. He tensed for a moment, surprised by the gesture, before relaxing and returning the hug. "Thank you," Laura whispered. "I know it's not an easy decision." Richard gently pulled away, looking into his daughter's eyes. "It's the right decision, and it's time I start making more of those." In the minutes that followed, Richard made a series of calls to Henry, his lawyer, instructing him to prepare the necessary documents, to his PR team, alerting them to the storm that was coming, and finally to Clara, informing her of the decision and promising to fight for her to the end. When he finished, Richard sat down in his chair, exhausted but strangely at peace. The road ahead would be difficult, of that he had no doubt. His company would face turbulence, his reputation would be questioned, and he would likely lose much of what he had built over the years. But looking at Laura, who remained by his side, firm and proud, Richard knew he was gaining something much more valuable. A chance at redemption, an opportunity to be the man Clara always believed him to be, and most importantly, the possibility of being the father Laura deserved. With a determined sigh, Richard stood up. It was time to face the board and begin the process of doing the right thing, no matter the cost. The auditorium of Miller Corporation was packed, A sea of anxious faces and news cameras pointed at the stage. Richard Miller, the once unshakable titan of business, nervously adjusted his tie before stepping up to the podium. "Good morning, everyone," he began, his voice firm despite the internal storm. "I am here today to make an announcement that will change the course of our company and, I hope, the healthcare sector in our country." In the following minutes, Richard detailed the medical error at Central Hospital, Clara's condition, and the company's decision to sever ties with the hospital and support a full investigation. The room buzzed with murmurs as he spoke, culminating in a frenzy of questions when he finished. Backstage, Laura watched with a mix of pride and apprehension. She knew how much this decision would cost her father, but she also saw a strength in him she had never imagined. The following weeks were a whirlwind. The following: Miller Corporation's stock plummeted, shareholders demanded explanations, and the media went into a frenzy. Richard faced long hours in crisis meetings and tense interviews. Amid the chaos, Clara's treatment began. Richard had mobilized the best specialists, determined to give her the best chance of recovery. Visits to the hospital became a constant in his new routine, often accompanied by Laura. One particularly difficult afternoon, after an especially exhausting treatment session for Clara, Richard and Laura sat in the hospital cafeteria. "How are you handling all this?" Laura asked, noticing the dark circles under her father's eyes. Richard offered a tired smile. "Honestly, it's the hardest challenge I've ever faced, but also the most rewarding." Laura nodded, taking his hand. "You know, when I came looking for you, I never imagined things would take this turn." "Neither did I." Richard laughed softly. "But I don't regret it for a second." At that moment, Richard's phone vibrated. It was Henry, his lawyer. "Richard, we have a problem. The board is calling an emergency meeting. They want to vote on your removal as CEO." The smile disappeared from Richard's face. He thanked Henry and hung up, turning to Laura with a heavy sigh. "Bad news?" she asked, concern evident in her voice. "The board wants to remove me," Richard replied, running a hand through his hair. "Fight was expected, but it still hurts," Laura completed softly. Richard nodded, feeling the weight of his decisions more than ever. He had built that company from scratch, dedicated his life to it. The idea of losing it was almost unbearable. Almost. Because when he looked at Laura, when he thought of Clara bravely fighting a disease caused by negligence, Richard realized that some things were more important than titles or fortunes. "You know what?" he said, a new determination shining in his eyes. "Let them remove me. I'll start a new company, one focused on improving the safety and quality of medical care. I'll use everything I've learned to make a real difference." Laura smiled, pride evident on her face. "That would be amazing, Dad." The weeks turned into months. Richard was, indeed, removed from the presidency of Miller Corporation, but that only fueled his determination. He channeled his energy into Clara's treatment and the creation of his new company, Safe Care Solutions. The relationship between Richard and Laura flourished during this period. They spent countless hours together, whether at the hospital with Clara or working on plans for the new company. Richard discovered a depth and wisdom in his daughter that constantly surprised him. Clara, for her part, responded well to the treatment. Although the road to recovery was long, there was a new hope in her eyes, a renewed strength fueled by Richard and Laura's support. One sunny afternoon, as the three of them walked through the hospital gardens, Clara in a wheelchair but with color in her cheeks for the first time in years, Richard reflected on the journey of the past months. He had lost his company, his fortune had diminished considerably, and his reputation in the business world was tarnished. But looking at Clara and Laura, chatting and laughing together, Richard realized he had gained something much more precious. He had regained his integrity, discovered the true meaning of family, and found a new purpose. The repercussions of his decision had been seismic, but from the ruins of his old world, a new and more meaningful one was emerging. With a smile, Richard joined the conversation between Clara and Laura, grateful for the second chance life had given him and determined not to waste it. The morning sun filtered through the windows of Richard Miller's new office. It was a modest space compared to his former office at Miller Corporation, But there was a different energy here, a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in a long time. Richard adjusted the plaque on his desk that read, Safe Care Solutions, Founder and CEO. The irony was not lost on him. He had lost a giant company but gained something far more valuable in the process. A soft knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. "Come in," he called. Laura entered, carrying a cardboard box. "Hey, Dad, I brought the latest files from the hospital. I think you'll want to take a look at these." Richard smiled, still marveling at how easily Laura now called him a dad. "Thank you, dear. How's your mum today?" "Better," Laura replied, her face lighting up. "The doctor said her latest tests are promising. The treatment is working." Richard felt a wave of relief and gratitude. The past 6 months had been an emotional roller coaster and a series of challenges. The legal battle against Central Hospital, Clara's intensive treatment, the launch of Safe Care Solutions, all of it while navigating the uncharted waters of late fatherhood. "That's great," he said, standing up to give Laura a hug. "How about we visit her later? We can bring that ice cream she loves." Laura nodded enthusiastically. "She'll love that." "Oh, and don't forget about the meeting with the investors this afternoon. They seem really interested in our medical error monitoring project." Richard couldn't help but smile at the use of "our." Laura had become an integral part of SafeCare, bringing a fresh perspective and innovative ideas. Their relationship had blossomed in ways he never imagined possible. "I won't forget," he assured her. "Now let's take a look at those files." As they worked side by side, Richard reflected on how much his life had changed. Losing Miller Corporation had been a hard blow, but it had also been a liberation. For the first time in decades, he felt he was doing something truly meaningful. Hours later, after a successful meeting with the investors, Richard and Laura headed to the hospital. On the way, they stopped to pick up Clara's favorite ice cream. When they entered Clara's hospital room, they were greeted by her radiant smile. She was sitting up in bed, looking stronger and healthier than she had in months. "I'm my two saviors," she joked, her eyes sparkling with affection. Richard felt a lump in his throat. Even after everything that had happened, Clara treated him with a kindness he knew he didn't fully deserve. "We brought a surprise," Laura announced, revealing the ice cream. As Clara savored the treat, the three of them chatted animatedly about the progress of her treatment, the latest developments at SafeCare, and their plans for the future. "You know," Clara said during a moment of pause, "I never imagined we'd be here, the three of us together like this." Richard nodded, his expression serious. "Clara, I'm so sorry for everything. If I could go back—" Clara raised her hand, gently interrupting him. "Richard, the past is the past. What matters is what we do from now on." Laura, sensing the emotion of the moment, took both their hands. "And we're going to do it together, right?" Richard felt tears welling up in his eyes, something he would have considered a weakness not long ago. Now he saw them as a sign of his newly rediscovered humanity. "Together," he agreed, his voice thick with emotion. That night, after leaving Clara to rest and taking Laura home, Richard stopped at a nearby park. Sitting on a bench, he watched the families around him, parents playing with their children, couples holding hands. Ordinary scenes he had ignored for so long, too busy building his empire. His phone buzzed with a notification. It was an article about the decline of Miller Corporation's stock and speculations about its uncertain future. In the past, this would have made him furious and anxious. Now he simply slid the phone back into his pocket, indifferent. Richard realized he had lost a lot: his company, his fortune, his reputation in the corporate world. But what he had gained was invaluable. An incredible daughter, a second chance with Clara, and the opportunity to make a real difference in the world. SafeCare Solutions was just beginning, but it already showed promising potential. More importantly, it was an endeavor based on ethical principles and a genuine desire to help people. As the sun set, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, Richard felt a peace he hadn't experienced in years. The road ahead was still uncertain and full of challenges, but for the first time in a long time, he was looking forward to the future. With a serene smile, Richard stood up and began walking home. Tomorrow would be another day full of possibilities and new chances to do the right thing, and he was ready to embrace them, not as the powerful CEO he once was, but as the man, father, and partner he was becoming. The new beginning he had feared so much had turned into the greatest blessing of his life. And Richard Miller, reborn through love, loss, and redemption, was determined to make every moment count.